The moment the room started laughing, I realized something inside me had gone very still. It was Saturday evening, October 14th, 2023, and my parents' 30th wedding anniversary party had filled my Aunt Carolyn Whitmore's house in Greensboro, North Carolina. The backyard patio lights glowed warm against the early autumn air, and the long wooden table was crowded with plates, wine glasses, and people who had known me my entire life. Family gatherings had always looked like this: comfortable, familiar, predictable. My Aunt Carolyn had insisted on organizing everything. She loved documenting family moments, and sometime after dessert, she announced that she had prepared a family tribute video for my parents. Everyone clapped. My parents, Robert and Linda Caldwell, sat side by side at the head of the table. My father looked slightly embarrassed by the attention, while my mother smiled the way she always did when something sentimental was about to happen. Carolyn dimmed the patio lights a little and turned her phone sideways so everyone could see the screen. The video began with old photographs, my parents on their wedding day in 1993. My sister and me as children in matching Easter dresses, beach vacations, Christmas mornings, birthday cakes with crooked candles. People around the table laughed softly as each memory passed. It was the kind of video that makes everyone feel like their family has always been close, even if real life is more complicated. Halfway through the video, switched from photos to short clips. Most of them were recent Sunday dinners, backyard barbecues, the usual things Carolyn liked to post online. In one clip, the same patio where we were sitting now appeared on the screen. The camera moved slowly around the table as everyone waved. My cousin Mark leaned forward in his chair, smiling at the memory. "That was last spring," he said. Carolyn nodded. "Yes, that was Easter lunch." The clip continued a little longer than expected. The camera lowered slightly, as if Carolyn had been about to stop recording, but the sound kept going. Someone at the table in the video asked my mother a casual question. "Is Hannah coming for Thanksgiving this year?" For a second, no one in the present-day patio reacted. It just sounded like normal conversation. Then my father chuckled. "You mean our ungrateful daughter?" A ripple of laughter spread through the speakers. Not shocked laughter, not confused laughter. The kind people share when a joke has been told before. On the screen, my mother lifted her wine glass and shook her head slightly. "Honestly," she said, sounding amused, "after everything we've done for her." Someone else added something I couldn't quite hear. More laughter followed. Around me, in the real patio, people were laughing too. The clip ended a second later. The screen faded back to the slideshow of smiling photos, but the room had already moved on to the next reaction. People clapping for the video, praising Carolyn's editing, raising their glasses again. I didn't move. No one noticed that I had stopped smiling. From the outside, it probably looked like I was just standing there, quietly among the rest of the family. Inside, something small had shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Just the slow, uncomfortable awareness that the way my parents talked about me when I wasn't there might be very different from the story I had believed for years. And the strange thing was, as the laughter faded and the party continued around me, I realized something else. No one at that table knew the one detail that made the whole joke wrong. Not my aunt, not my cousins, not even my parents. They had absolutely no idea who had been paying most of their bills. And for the first time that evening, I began to wonder what would happen if that quiet detail ever stopped being invisible. The party ended a little after 9 that night. By the time I left my Aunt Carolyn's house, the patio lights were still glowing behind me, and the sound of people talking drifted softly into the quiet Greensboro street. A few cousins were helping carry dishes inside. Someone called out goodnight. My mother waved from the porch, still smiling from the evening. Nothing about the scene suggested anything unusual had happened. I drove back to the small hotel near Friendly Center, where I was staying for the weekend. Greensboro wasn't far from Raleigh, where I lived and worked, but when family events ran late, it was easier not to drive home the same night. The room was quiet when I walked in. Hotel rooms have a particular kind of silence. Neutral, temporary, like the place is waiting for someone else's story tomorrow. I set my purse on the desk and sat down on the edge of the bed. For a while, I didn't do anything. I just listened to the hum of the air conditioner and thought about the way everyone had laughed. Not loudly, just comfortably. Eventually, I reached for my phone. My Aunt Carolyn had already posted the video. That wasn't surprising. Carolyn documented almost everything: birthdays, Sunday lunches, backyard gardening updates. Her social media page was a running archive of family life. The caption read, 30 wonderful years. Family dinner tonight. I tapped the video. 47 seconds. That was the length. I watched it once, without pausing. The same opening photos appeared on the small screen, my parents' wedding day childhood pictures, holidays. The cheerful music Carolyn had added played softly through the phone speaker. Then the clip from Easter lunch appeared. The camera moved around the table, exactly the way I remembered. My cousin Mark laughing. My father leaning back in his chair. My mother adjusting her napkin. Then the moment. Is Hannah coming for Thanksgiving this year? My father chuckled. You mean our ungrateful daughter? Even on the phone, the laughter sounded the same. I didn't rewind right away. Instead, I stared at the frozen image on the screen. My parents sitting at the table, sunlight on the patio behind them. The moment captured in a way no one at that lunch had realized. After a few seconds, I played it again. Not because I needed to confirm what I had heard, because I was trying to understand the tone. There had been no anger in my father's voice. No frustration. No sense that he was saying something he might regret later. He had sounded relaxed, amused. The way people sound when they repeat a joke they have shared before. The second time I watched, I paid closer attention to the others at the table. No one looked surprised. My mother had smiled faintly when my father said it. Someone out of frame added a comment about kids who never grow up. Then the laughter again. I watched the video a third time. By the end of it, the music Carolyn had added felt strangely out of place, like it belonged to a different story than the one my mind was beginning to piece together. I set the phone down on the bedside table. Moments like that don't explode the way people expect. They rearrange things quietly. You start remembering details that never seemed important before. The way certain comments at family gatherings always drifted toward jokes about responsibility. The way relatives sometimes asked if I was still figuring things out. At the time, I had assumed they were just making conversation. Now I wondered how long that version of me had existed in their minds. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street. Somewhere down the hallway, a door closed. On the nightstand, my phone screen went dark. For the first time since the party, a different thought settled in. If my parents truly believed I was the one depending on them, then the story they had been telling the rest of the family might be very different from the life I had actually been living. And once a story like that settles into a family, it rarely changes on its own. Sunday morning arrived quietly. The sunlight coming through the thin hotel curtains in Greensboro was softer than the patio lights from the night before. For a moment, I lay still in bed, trying to remember what had woken me. Then I remembered the video. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen showed a few routine notifications, emails from work, a weather alert about rain later in the week, and a message from a coworker asking about a project timeline for Monday. Nothing from my family. I sat up slowly, letting the memory of the previous night settle back into place. The laughter, my father's voice, my mother's calm agreement. On the screen of my phone, Carolyn's video had already gathered more reactions overnight. A few relatives had commented under it. Beautiful memories. 30 years goes by fast. Such a wonderful family. I scrolled past the comments without reading them carefully and opened a different app. My banking app. I hadn't intended to check it. The action was almost automatic, the way people glance at the weather even when they already know it's sunny. The list of transactions appeared. Groceries, gas, a restaurant charge from Raleigh 2 days earlier. Then the scheduled transfers. I stared at the screen for a moment before tapping into the section that listed recurring payments. The list was longer than I remembered. Some of the transfers were small and ordinary. A streaming service, a monthly donation to the local food bank in Raleigh. But further down the page were several entries that had been there for years. Property tax payment, medical insurance premium, utility account support. Each one was scheduled to transfer automatically every month. The account numbers attached to them were familiar. My parents' accounts. I set the phone down on the hotel desk and leaned back in the chair. The strange thing about helping family financially is how easily it blends into everyday life. You set something up once, then months turn into years. At the time, each decision had felt simple. 6 years earlier, when my father retired earlier than planned, he had called me one evening, sounding more tired than I had ever heard him. The pension numbers hadn't been what he expected. Nothing catastrophic, just tighter than they had planned. At the time, I was already working in Raleigh, settled into my job as a data analyst at an insurance company. My salary was steady, and my expenses were relatively simple. Helping out for a while had seemed obvious. The first payment had been for property taxes on their house in Greensboro. Just a temporary bridge, we had called it. After that came the medical insurance policy. My mother had always disliked dealing with paperwork and policy renewals, so I handled the details online each year. Later, there were other things. A utility account that occasionally needed extra support during the winter months. A contribution toward home maintenance when the roof needed repairs. None of it had felt dramatic at the time. Families helped each other. That was the way I had always understood it. What I hadn't paid attention to was how the story looked from the outside. The banking app on my phone still displayed the next scheduled transfer date. 3 weeks from now. I tapped one of the entries and looked at the payment history. The timeline stretched back year after year. Quiet confirmations, regular amounts, reliable. I thought again about the moment in the video when my father laughed. "You mean our ungrateful daughter?" The words sounded different now, not because I had misunderstood them, but because for the first time, I was looking at the situation from both sides at once. On one side was the version of me that existed in that video. On the other side was the list of transfers still glowing on my phone screen. Neither one of those things had been hidden, but somehow they had never been connected. And sitting there in the quiet hotel room, it occurred to me that if someone else had looked at this list of payments, they might start asking questions the rest of my family had never thought to ask. Monday morning arrived with the quiet routine of normal life. By 8:30, I was back at my desk in Raleigh, North Carolina, the familiar hum of the insurance company office settling around me. Rows of cubicles, soft keyboard, tapping the low murmur of phone calls. Nothing in the room suggested that anything unusual had happened over the weekend. Work had a way of doing that. It absorbed attention and smoothed out emotional edges. For most of the morning, I focused on spreadsheets and claim data, the kind of detailed analysis that had been my job for almost 7 years now. Numbers were predictable. Patterns revealed themselves if you looked long enough. People were less precise. Around lunchtime, I stepped into the small break room with a cup of coffee and checked my phone. Carolyn's anniversary video had continued circulating through the extended family. A few more relatives had shared it. Someone had added a comment praising my parents for building such a stable life together after retirement. I stared at that sentence longer than I expected. Such a stable life together. It was interesting how easily a narrative forms around visible things. A house that had been in the family for decades. A couple who appeared comfortable at family dinners. A retirement that seemed calm and orderly from the outside. No one in those comments mentioned property taxes, or insurance payments, or the quiet recurring transfers that had appeared on my banking screen the night before. The truth didn't contradict the story exactly. It just lived in a place most people never looked. I set my phone down and returned to my desk. Later that afternoon, my coworker Melissa leaned over the divider between our cubicles. Melissa Grant had joined the department about 2 years earlier. She was the kind of person who noticed small things. "You were out Friday," she said. "Family trip." "Anniversary party," I said. "My parents, 30 years. Melissa smiled. "That's impressive." She paused for a moment, then added, "My parents didn't make it past 20. Her tone was light, but there was something thoughtful behind it. 30 years takes work, she said. I nodded politely, though my mind drifted back to the video, to the moment everyone had laughed. Later that evening, after driving home through the familiar Raleigh traffic, I made dinner in my apartment and tried not to think about it again. But family stories have a way of resurfacing when you least expect them. While I was washing dishes, my phone buzzed with a message from my cousin Mark. Mark had been at the party Saturday night. He was one of the easier relatives to talk to someone who generally avoided family drama. Great party. The other night, the message read, "Your parents looked really happy." A second message followed a few seconds later. "Carolyn's video is getting a lot of attention online. My mom shared it with some of the relatives in Florida." I dried my hands on a towel and read the messages again. Mark meant it as a friendly update. To him, the video was simply a nice family moment, spreading through the extended network of cousins and aunts. The kind of thing people like to see. I typed a short reply, "Glad everyone enjoyed it." He sent a thumbs up emoji, and the conversation ended there. But the message stayed in my mind long after, because every time someone shared that video, the same version of the story traveled with it. A happy couple celebrating 30 years. A warm, close family gathered around them. And somewhere inside that story, a quiet joke about their ungrateful daughter. The strange part was how easily people accepted the version of events they could see. No one asked questions about the details behind it. No one wondered why certain bills always seemed to get paid on time. Stories that look stable rarely invite investigation. As I turned off the kitchen light and walked into the living room, a new realization settled quietly into place. The narrative my family believed about me hadn't appeared overnight. It had been forming for years, and once a story like that becomes familiar, it can grow stronger every time someone repeats it, especially when no one challenges it. Tuesday evening after work, I sat at my kitchen table in Raleigh with my laptop open, my phone beside it, and a yellow legal pad I hadn't used in months. Outside, traffic moved steadily past my apartment building. Inside, everything was still. I had spent the day doing what adults do when something in their life begins to split quietly down the middle. I answered emails. I sat through a meeting about quarterly reporting. I nodded at the right moments. I finished a project review before 5 o'clock. But underneath all of it, one thought had remained in place. I needed to see everything clearly. Not emotionally, not morally, financially. So I logged into my bank account from my laptop instead of my phone and pulled up the full record of recurring transfers. The larger screen made everything harder to ignore. There they were arranged in clean rows with dates, account numbers, and descriptions that looked almost sterile. Property tax support, medical insurance premium, utility assistance, seasonal transfer to household reserve. There was even a separate recurring deposit. I had nearly forgotten about money sent every quarter into the checking account my father used for daily expenses. A cushion he had once described as just until things level out. Things had never leveled out. I wrote each item down on the legal pad, one line at a time. Not because I needed the list, because I needed to feel the weight of it in my own handwriting. When I finished, I set the pen down and looked at the page. It wasn't just help. It was infrastructure. That was the word that came to me unexpectedly. Not generosity, not support. Infrastructure. For years, I had been serving as one of the quiet structures underneath my parents' life. The part no one talked about, because everything above it looked stable. Their house still looked like their house. Their retirement still looked like retirement. Their holidays still looked warm and orderly in photographs. And because I had never corrected anyone, everyone had been free to believe the surface, including them. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment. The easiest thing would have been to do nothing. That is one of the least discussed truths about family. Silence can feel more responsible than conflict, especially when you've spent years convincing yourself that keeping things smooth is the same as keeping things loving. But something had changed since Saturday night. Before the party, my silence had protected their dignity. Now, it was protecting a lie that had begun turning me into someone else inside the family story. My phone buzzed on the table. For a second, I thought it might be my mother. Instead, it was a calendar reminder for a meeting the next morning. I turned the sound off and looked back at the list. Each payment had a next transfer date attached to it. Each one would continue exactly as it had for years, unless I stepped in and changed it. That was the part that mattered. Nothing dramatic had to happen for this arrangement to go on indefinitely. No one needed to ask me. No one needed to thank me. No one even needed to tell the truth. All that was required was my continued participation. And for the first time, that felt less like kindness and more like consent. I picked up the pen again and drew a line beneath the final item on the page. Then I wrote one sentence under it. If I leave this in place, I am agreeing with the version of me they told the room. I stared at that sentence for a long time. It felt harsher on paper than it had in my head, but not inaccurate. That was the real break, I think. Not anger, not revenge. Just the moment when I understood that continuing to fund their comfort, after hearing them laugh at me, would no longer be generosity. It would be self-erasure. I closed the notebook, but I didn't close the laptop. The account page was still open in front of me waiting. And for the first time since I had seen Carolyn's video, I knew exactly what the next step was going to be. Wednesday evening arrived, colder than the rest of the week. A steady autumn rain had started around sunset in Raleigh, tapping softly against the windows of my apartment. I finished dinner, rinsed the plate in the sink, and returned to the kitchen table where my laptop still waited. The same banking page from the night before was open. Rows of numbers, dates, accounts. Nothing about the screen looked emotional. It was just a system designed to move money from one place to another with quiet efficiency. For years, that system had worked exactly as intended. I sat down and read through the list again. Property tax support, medical insurance premium, utility assistance, quarterly transfer to my father's household account. Each one had a scheduled date attached to it. The next transfer would happen automatically in a few weeks. Unless I changed something. The cursor blinked slowly in the corner of the screen. The first cancellation took less than 10 seconds. I clicked the property tax transfer, opened the settings, and selected Cancel Recurring Payment. A small confirmation window appeared asking if I was sure. I paused for a moment, not because I doubted the decision, because it felt strangely quiet. Then I clicked Confirm. The line disappeared from the schedule. For a second, I simply stared at the empty space where it had been. 6 years of payments erased with a single administrative action. The next one was the insurance premium. That cancellation took even less time. 2 clicks, a confirmation box, and the monthly transfer was gone. I moved down the list slowly, one entry at a time. Utility support. Canceled. Quarterly household deposit. Canceled. Each time, the system asked the same neutral question. Are you sure you want to stop this payment? And each time, the answer was the same. Yes. When I finished, the list looked almost unfamiliar. Most of the recurring transfers connected to my parents had disappeared, leaving only the smaller, personal payments that belonged to my own life. I leaned back in the chair and exhaled. There had been no shouting, no confrontation, no dramatic announcement, just a series of small administrative decisions. The kind banks process every day without noticing the lives behind them. My phone buzzed softly on the table. This time, it was a message from Daniel Price, my financial advisor. Daniel had been helping manage my investment account for several years now. He was careful with questions, the way good advisors usually are. His message was short. Received your transfer request for the support fund. Moving it back into your primary portfolio tomorrow. The support fund. I had set it up years earlier as a separate account, specifically for my parents' expenses. Money flowed from it into the monthly transfers that had just disappeared from my screen. Thanks, Daniel, I typed back. He replied with a simple confirmation. That was the end of the conversation. Outside, the rain continued tapping against the window. Inside the apartment, the quiet felt different than it had the night before. Not lighter yet, just clearer. For years, my role in my parents' financial life had been invisible. The structure had functioned in the background, unnoticed by most of the people benefiting from it. Now the structure was gone, but nothing had changed on the surface. My parents were still living in the same house in Greensboro. The family story about them still sounded the same. The video from the anniversary party was probably still circulating through relatives' phones. What had changed existed in a place no one else could see yet. Time. The next property tax notice would arrive eventually. The insurance company would expect the next premium. Utility bills would still come in the mail. And for the first time in years, those responsibilities would arrive without a quiet system waiting underneath them. I closed the laptop and carried it to the living room. As I set it down on the coffee table, one thought crossed my mind. Not with satisfaction, not even with anger, just simple awareness. Sooner or later, someone was going to notice that the structure holding things together had quietly disappeared. And when that moment arrived, the conversation my parents had laughed through in Carolyn's video would finally have consequences. 3 weeks passed before anyone noticed. It was Thursday afternoon, November 2nd, when my phone rang while I was leaving the office in Raleigh. The sky had already turned the pale gray that comes earlier in the fall, and most of my coworkers were packing up for the day. My mother's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I simply looked at it. Linda Caldwell, the same name that had appeared on my phone thousands of times over the years. Usually about small things, holiday plans, a recipe she couldn't find, sometimes just a casual check-in. This time I let it ring. The call ended, and a few seconds later, the familiar notification sound announced a voicemail. I slipped the phone into my coat pocket and walked to the parking garage before listening to it. My mother's voice sounded slightly strained, though she was clearly trying to keep it casual. "Hannah, hi. Your father was checking the account this morning, and it looks like the transfer didn't come through this month. I'm sure it's just some kind of bank delay. Call me back when you can." The message ended there. No accusation, just confusion. I sat in the driver's seat of my car for a moment before starting the engine. Outside, a few yellow leaves slid across the concrete floor of the garage as a cold wind moved through the open levels. My phone buzzed again before I had even backed out of the parking space. This time, it was a text message. "Did something happen with the bank transfer this month? Your father says it didn't arrive." I read the message twice. In the past, I would have answered immediately. Over the years, the arrangement between us had become routine enough that even a small delay usually triggered a quick conversation. A misplaced decimal, a transfer arriving a day late, those things happened. But this time there was no mistake to correct. I drove home before replying. Traffic on the highway was slow, the usual late afternoon congestion heading out of downtown Raleigh. The rhythm of brake lights and moving cars gave me time to think about the shape of the answer. When I reached my apartment, I set my keys on the kitchen counter and made tea before picking up the phone again. Not because I was avoiding the message, because I wanted the reply to be simple. No explanation, no argument, just a fact. I opened the conversation and typed, "Nothing went wrong with the bank. I ended the financial support arrangements." For a moment, the message sat on the screen before I pressed send. The response came quickly. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, the message arrived. "What do you mean you ended it?" I leaned against the kitchen counter and read the question. There was no anger in it yet, just disbelief. In the quiet of my apartment, I realized something else. My parents had never once asked whether the transfers would continue. For years, the payments had simply appeared. Regular, reliable, almost like a pension. And somewhere along the way, that reliability had turned into expectation. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my mother. "Hannah, if something changed with your finances, you should have told us. Your father already scheduled the property tax payment based on that transfer." The words were careful, but the meaning underneath them was clear. In their version of events, the problem wasn't the system that had quietly depended on me. The problem was that the system had stopped working. I typed one more message. "My finances are fine. I just won't be providing that support anymore." This time, the reply took longer. When it arrived, it was shorter than I expected. "We'll talk about this soon." I set the phone down on the counter. The conversation had stayed calm, almost polite. But something fundamental had shifted. For years, my parents had assumed the structure underneath their life was permanent. Now they knew it wasn't. And judging by the tone of that last message, they had already decided that this conversation wasn't over. My mother called again the following Monday, but this time I didn't answer at all. By then, the temperature had dropped across North Carolina, and the first real cold of November had settled in. I left for work before sunrise and came home after dark, keeping my days structured and my evenings quiet. The messages kept coming, not many, just enough to make it clear that my parents had moved past confusion and into calculation. One text from my mother asked whether I had overreacted to a harmless joke. Another said my father was under a lot of pressure and that this was not the right time to make things harder. I read each message once and then set my phone down. What struck me wasn't the content. It was the framing. At no point did either of them ask what the video had felt like from my side. They didn't deny what they had said. They didn't apologize for laughing. Instead, they moved immediately toward management of the money, of the inconvenience, of the timing. It told me more than any explanation could have. By midweek, the situation began leaking beyond private messages. My cousin Mark called Wednesday evening while I was folding laundry in my apartment. His voice carried the careful tone people use when they know they've stepped into something delicate. "Hey," he said. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. You're fine." He hesitated. "My mom mentioned there's some tension with your parents." That was one way to describe it. I sat down on the arm of the couch and waited. "She said your dad's been stressed about bills," Mark continued. "I guess there was some issue with an account or a transfer." There it was, the first shift. The family story was changing. Not publicly, not all at once, but enough that details were starting to travel. I kept my voice even. There wasn't an issue with the bank. Mark was quiet for a second. "Okay." He didn't push, and I appreciated that. Before we ended the call, he said something that stayed with me long after. "I think a lot of people assumed your parents had things more settled than they actually do." After we hung up, I stood in the middle of the living room for a long moment. That sentence mattered, not because it was dramatic, because it confirmed what I had started to understand. The story wasn't collapsing because I had exposed it. It was weakening because reality had begun putting pressure on it. The next clue came 2 days later. Friday afternoon, during a short break at work, I checked my email and saw a forwarded message from my mother. No explanation, no greeting, just a property tax notice from Guilford County, attached as a PDF with the payment due date highlighted. I stared at it for several seconds, not because I was confused, because the gesture was so familiar. For years, my mother had sent documents that way: insurance renewals, home repair estimates, tax notices, without needing to say much. The assumption had always been the same: I would take care of it. This time, I didn't open the attachment right away. Instead, I looked at the subject line and understood something important. They still believed this could be handled privately, quietly, as if the problem was administrative rather than relational, as if they could slide the burden back toward me, without ever naming what had happened at the anniversary party. That was the point where my thinking changed. Until then, I had assumed that stepping back financially would be enough. That once the transfers stopped, the reality underneath their life would speak for itself. But families are skilled at protecting old narratives. They can absorb missing money faster than they can absorb moral truth. If I did nothing now, my parents would keep telling a version of the story where I had become cold, impulsive, selfish, while still leaving out the years of support that had made their stability possible in the first place. I finally opened the attachment, then closed it again without replying. The tax deadline was real. The bills were real. The pressure was real. But something else was becoming real too. For the first time since Carolyn's video, I stopped thinking only about what I was withdrawing. I started thinking about what I might eventually have to say. Not everything, not yet, but enough to make sure the next version of the family story would not be written without me. The next family gathering happened the Saturday before Thanksgiving. Carolyn hosted again, this time a smaller lunch at her house in Greensboro. The weather had turned sharp and dry, and the trees in her neighborhood were mostly bare now. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in my car for a few seconds before getting out, watching my breath cloud faintly against the windshield. I had almost declined the invitation, not because I was afraid of a scene. By then, I knew my parents well enough to understand that open scenes were not their style. They preferred softer methods, omission, tone, the careful reshaping of events until the person on the other side began to sound unreasonable. That was why I came. Inside, the house smelled like roasted vegetables, coffee, and the faint sweetness of pie cooling somewhere in the kitchen. My Aunt Carolyn greeted me with the same warmy energy she always had, as if the anniversary party and everything after it belonged to a different family. My parents were already there. My father, Robert, stood near the dining room window with a cup of coffee in his hand. My mother, Linda, was arranging napkins at the table beside Carolyn. Both of them glanced up when I walked in. There was a brief pause, not long enough to be called awkward by anyone else, just long enough for all of us to register that things were no longer normal. Lunch moved forward, with that particular kind of politeness families use when they are trying to keep a fragile surface intact. My cousin Mark was there, along with Carolyn's husband David and Mark's mother, my Aunt Jean, who had driven in from Winston-Salem that morning. Conversation stayed on safe topics at first: weather, holiday traffic, the price of groceries. Someone mentioned the unusually high property tax bills this year, and for a moment, the room seemed to tighten without anyone acknowledging it. Then, Carolyn, without thinking, brought up the anniversary video. "It's still getting comments," she said, smiling, as she set a bowl of green beans on the table. "People loved that tribute. I think it may be the nicest thing I've ever put together." No one answered immediately. My mother gave a small smile, but she didn't look at me. Mark shifted in his chair. It was one of those moments where the entire room feels a step away from something, even if only one person understands exactly what that something is. I set down my fork. "It was memorable," I said. Carolyn laughed lightly. "Well, families always remember the sentimental ones." I looked at her, then at my parents. There was more truth in it than I think anyone realized. That changed the air in the room. Not dramatically. No one gasped. No one dropped a glass. But attention moved. My father straightened slightly by the window. My mother's hand stopped on the edge of her napkin. Carolyn looked confused. "What do you mean?" I kept my voice calm. "I mean, the part where my parents joked about me being ungrateful." No one interrupted. I didn't rush to fill the silence. For the first time since the anniversary party, the conversation was no longer happening around me. It was happening in front of me. My mother gave a quiet, dismissive shake of her head. "Hannah, that was clearly a joke." I turned toward her. "Maybe me, but it was an interesting joke, considering I had been covering your property taxes, insurance payments, and part of your household expenses for years." The room went completely still. This time, the silence did not feel fragile. It felt final. Carolyn blinked at me. "What?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look at anyone else for support. "I'm not saying that to embarrass anyone," I said. "I'm saying it because the version of me that keeps getting passed around this family is false." My father set down his coffee mug harder than he meant to. "That is not how this should be discussed." It was the closest he had come to anger in front of other people. And that was what mattered, not the volume, the loss of control. Aunt Jean, who had been silent most of the meal, looked from my father to me with a face I couldn't fully read. "You were paying those bills?" she asked. I nodded once, yes. No one defended the joke after that. No one repeated the word ungrateful. The family story that had traveled so easily through Carolyn's video suddenly had weight attached to it. Now dates bills, obligations, facts, things harder to laugh through. My mother tried once more to recover the room. "We've all helped each other at different times," she said carefully. I met her eyes. That's true. But only one version of the story was being told. No one spoke for several seconds. Outside, a gust of late November wind moved through the bare branches beyond the dining room window. Inside, the room had changed in a way that could not be undone. For the first time, my parents were no longer managing the story alone. And even though nothing had been settled yet, not the money, not the distance, not whatever came next. The cost of what they had said at that anniversary party had finally become public. December came in gradually. By the second week of the month, Raleigh had taken on that muted winter look it always gets before Christmas. Bare trees, pale skies, the early darkness, settling over everything before most people had finished dinner. The sharpness of late November had eased, and with it, some of the raw edge of what had happened at Carolyn's table. Not all of it, but enough. After that lunch, my parents did what I think they had always done when a version of events stopped working. They adjusted. Not publicly, not dramatically. There was no family-wide apology. No long message admitting what had been said in the anniversary video. No formal acknowledgement of the years I had spent quietly supporting parts of their life in Greensboro. What there was instead was distance. Fewer messages. No more forwarded bills. No more documents landing in my inbox with highlighted due dates, as if my role in their finances could simply resume if everyone ignored the conversation that had taken place. That, in its own way, was the clearest resolution I was ever going to get. The support had ended. The expectation had ended with it. And the family version of me that had once moved so easily through Carolyn's video no longer fit the facts well enough to be repeated quite so comfortably. Mark texted me once in early December to ask how I was doing. His message was simple, and I appreciated that. Hope you're okay. Things have been quieter. I read it twice before answering. They have. I think that's probably for the best. He replied with a message about coming through Raleigh sometime after the holidays and taking me to lunch. No drama, no questions, just a small, ordinary gesture of family that didn't require anyone to pretend the past few weeks had meant nothing. At work, life kept moving. Quarter-end reports, long meetings, coffee gone cold on my desk. Melissa noticed one afternoon that I seemed different, less tired, she said, almost casually, while we waited for a spreadsheet to load in a conference room. I smiled a little. Maybe. She nodded as if she understood more than I had actually said. And maybe she did. Relief doesn't always look like happiness at first. Sometimes it looks like space. Space in your schedule. Space in your mind. Space where obligation used to live. A few days before Christmas, Daniel sent me an update on my investment portfolio. The support fund that had once sat in a separate account for my parents had now been folded back into my long-term planning. Retirement contributions, emergency reserves, a future that was shaped around my own life instead of being quietly redirected toward someone else's. I stared at the numbers on the screen for a long time, not because the money itself felt like victory. It didn't. What mattered was what the numbers represented now. Choice. For years, I had confused usefulness with love. I thought if I kept things stable, kept things paid, kept things smooth, then I was protecting the family. What I understand now is that protection only works when it moves in both directions. Otherwise, it isn't care. It's erosion. I still thought about the anniversary video sometimes. 47 seconds. That was all it had taken. Not to destroy anything exactly, just to reveal something that had already been there, hidden inside years of easy assumptions and one-sided gratitude. By January, the silence between my parents and me had become less charged. Not repaired, not warm, just settled. And that, too, felt honest. Some relationships do not end in dramatic exits. They simply lose the false structure that was holding them in place. What remains may be smaller, quieter, and far less sentimental than what people expected from the outside. But it is real. On a cold Sunday evening in early January, I made tea, turned off the lamp in my living room, and glanced at my phone before setting it face down on the table. No missed calls, no requests, no emergencies disguised as family obligations. Just my own quiet apartment, my own steady life, and a kind of peace that felt unfamiliar enough to notice. The anniversary video hadn't taken anything from me. It had given me timing. It had shown me the truth before I lost more years trying to support a version of family that existed only when I stayed invisible inside it. And in the end, that was the strangest part. The quiet decision I made that rainy Wednesday night was never really about money. It was about finally refusing to fund a story that required my silence in order to survive. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect, I'd really like to know what that looked like for you. And if this story stayed with you, a like or a follow helps more people find the next one. There's always another family truth waiting just beneath the surface.